Hi everyone, let's start lecture 4 of our course, which is chapter 3 of the textbook, and it's about aggregate planning. This lecture will be covered in 4 parts, and this is the first part. On the course map, we are right here, chapter 3 of the textbook, aggregate planning, sales and operations planning. So here, after completing chapter 2, we assume that we have forecasted the future demands, and now we are going to prepare the production plan of the company. Okay. As the agenda of this chapter, at first we'll have an introduction to aggregate planning, and then we'll see what's the process of sales and operations planning in a typical manufacturing firm. And then we'll go through the aggregate planning of production and capacity. So at first we'll have the definition of aggregate unit, and then we'll see what's the hierarchical production planning, and then we will review the relevant costs in aggregate planning of production and capacity, and then we'll see what are the competing objectives and what are the strategies for aggregate planning, and at the end we'll have a prototype example. Okay, and at the end of this chapter we will have a linear programming model for aggregate planning, and at the end as a conclusion, we will have the extensions that we can make on the linear programming model. Okay. Introduction to aggregate planning. Actually, aggregate planning is a top-down sales and operations plan for the entire firm or a product line. Let me explain by having a figure here. Let's say this is our company. So we have sales and marketing department in the front line, communicating with market and customers, right? And then, so this is our sales and marketing department. And then we have the production department, actually, or manufacturing department. And then we have the warehouses of material and parts which are supplied from outside from the suppliers. Okay, so in this environment, the sales and marketing department actually will forecast the future demand. Okay, and then this demand will be a given parameter here in order to prepare an aggregate plan. Okay, and this plan will be used in the entire firm, and it could be aggregated over the entire firm, or it could be aggregated over the family of products or product lines. And then here actually the production department will work with this plan. The warehouse or inventory control also will work with this plan, and also the suppliers actually can work with this plan. So this plan will plan and control actually the whole process from supplying the material and parts into the warehouse and then production line. So this is what we mean here by having an aggregate plan. Okay. So the goal of an aggregate plan is plan the gross workforce levels as the capacity for production, and then a firm-wide production plan for products. So for the capacity, here we are considering the number of employees. So we will obtain the number of employees that firm will need in the future periods in the planning horizon. So we'll consider new hirings maybe, or firing, and so on, to level the number of employees over the course of the planning horizon. Okay, and then we will talk about the quantity and mix of products to be produced. So yeah, since it's an aggregate plan, we will actually plan for production. So in production of products, we need to talk about the mix and the quantities to be produced, and also the capacity. And here we are assuming the number of employees. Okay, and since we are considering a certain level of employees for production, and we are going to have a production level each period, so we may need to store some units in the warehouse in order to deal with future demand. So here, yes, we will talk about the inventory at the end of each period regarding our plan. Okay. So here, in order to obtain the aggregate plan, we need to consolidate the similar items or services into product groups. So we'll have product lines or family of products, and also the same for the capacity. I mean, for the resources, different machines into machine centers, or maybe in the market we can combine similar customers into a market region. So yeah, here we're going to have, let's say, a top level plan for the company, not a lower level plan. So here the aggregate planning is also called sales and operations process. So S&OP, I mean sales and operations process, is a business process, right? So yeah, here we are talking about combining the strategic plan that we have for the firm for long term and daily operations. So yes, the S&OP process will integrate the strategic plans of the company with the daily operations in order to balance demand and supply for the products. So usually S&OP process in different businesses are different, but there are some common elements. For example, the first one is strategically focused. So in S&OP process, we need to be focused on the strategies. So without having a good knowledge about the strategies of the company, how can we make a balance between demand and supply? So we need to know about the strategies. And it's also conducted through a cross-functional team. So since this is an aggregate plan, it's going to consider the demand, the capacities in production, and constraints or resources in production, and then constraints or resources in inventory and suppliers. So this cannot be done just in a single department. I mean, for example, let's say the marketing department. It can't be done in there. There should be a team from different departments: sales and marketing, production, supply, and warehouse. Then this team should work on the aggregate plan of the company. Okay. The reason that here we are considering aggregation, because it's impossible to forecast demand for each individual item in the company, because a company may have thousands of items for sale or for production, and usually we call them as SKU, so stock keeping unit. So yeah, it's impossible to make plan for more than 1,000 items in a company. So usually we need to combine them into categories, into product lines, and then or aggregate them in those categories and groups, and then we'll prepare the plan for those aggregated units. Okay, and for the aggregate planning, we need to consider time fences. So here, because of the uncertainty, and in order to deal with the uncertainty, we need to consider a a time horizon for aggregate planning, and it should be, for example, a week or a month, and it depends to the nature of uncertainty in that industry, and based on that we can obtain what period is appropriate for aggregate planning. So since the aggregate planning is a plan for future, so we have uncertainty in future characteristics, future demand, or future supply, and so on. So let's see what are the common strategies here to deal with uncertainty in aggregate planning. So we can use actually these three strategies. The first one is buffering. In buffering, we will assign excess inventory or capacity, like the employees, or the capacity of machines and so on, or time, to cover the fluctuations in supply or demand. Okay. The second one is pooling. So in the pooling, we share buffers to cover multiple sources of availability. For example, let's say we have different markets, so we don't need to have separate buffer for each market. We can have one buffer as a pool that will serve all the different markets. Okay, and the third one is the contingency plan. So here we are talking about a preset course of actions for an anticipated scenario. For example, backup suppliers or sourcing from the spot market. Okay. So this is the chart of the planning and control framework for Heineken in Netherlands. And as you see here, the aggregate production planning and sales and operations planning are right here. So as you see here, they are covering the strategic part and also the tactical part of the planning. So as you see here, the sales and operations plan is somehow a bridge between the strategic part and the tactical part in order to translate the strategies into the daily operations. Okay. So let's see what are the types of uncertainty in aggregate planning or sales and operations process, and how we can deal with these types of uncertainties in aggregate planning. The first type is a variation. So here we have a regular behavior in the system, so regular process. So anything that may change the regular process in the system, then it's a variation, right? For example, variability in customer orders, yeah, variability in quality or lead time. So these causes may change the regular behavior or process of the system, right? So we can describe these type of uncertainties by a probability distribution. Okay. The second one is foreseen uncertainty. So it's not called known unknowns. So yeah, these are the risks that can be foreseen and planned for. Okay. So for example, supply breakdowns, or design changes, or natural disasters, or labor strikes, and so on. So yeah, we can assign a probability of occurrence for these events. Okay. The third one, and maybe the worst one, is unforeseen uncertainty. So here it's unknown unknowns. Yeah, risks that cannot be predicted ahead of time. So we can't be prepared for that. So for example, natural disasters of unusual scale or in regions where they do not typically occur. It's disaster, right? So, and competitive innovations, for example. So these are called black swan events. So yeah, they are rare, but if they happen, we are not ready for that, right? So it will be a difficult situation actually. So the fourth one is a chaos, unforeseen uncertainty that not only affects the operations, but also the fundamental goal of the company. So this is the worst one, not the the first one. Yeah, the chaos is definitely is the worst case here. Okay.